Hey everyone, for this lecture we will focus on evaluating scholarly journal articles. And remember, anytime you hear scholarly journal article or peer-reviewed journal article, they really mean the same thing. So try not to get too confused with the terminology. In the subject database lecture and the selecting a subject database lecture, you learned about the nature of subject databases and you learned the basics of getting to a subject database. We'll review that quickly here, but then mostly focus on evaluating those scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles, which is what you will be tasked with finding while using subject databases. Having viewed the previous two lectures, you should have a good idea of how to access subject databases through library.sc.edu, but I did want to reiterate that for the assignment for this unit, you will not be looking in the all-purpose section for databases, and since you will be searching for articles, you'll also want to avoid the statistics area of the library databases as well. So we're really just keying in on all of the other subject areas that are listed here. Also, remember to ignore the type section that you'll see on this page. We're really just looking for subject areas. Here's some good examples of subject-specific article databases. PubMed Medline, which is really good for public health or medicine. CINAHL, which is good for nursing, but also medicine in general. Business Source Complete, obviously that would be a business database. Education Full Text plus ERIC, those are both education databases that you can search simultaneously. PsycInfo is a psychology database. Criminal Justice Abstracts. And we also have two that are a little less discipline specific, but can be narrowed down to subject areas, Web of Science and Science Direct. Just as a caution, not every database we have access to is exactly an article database. So if you get into something and you're like, where are the articles? Then you may be in a more business or statistic heavy database or something that just doesn't really provide articles as its main scope. And so you might want to jump out and find one that is more oriented toward pointing you to articles. So for example, EBIS World is a business database. It's really just industry information. There's some reports, but it's not exactly journal articles. Same kind of goes for SciFinder Web, which is a chemical compounds and patents database, not really articles. And Merck Index is another example of this, which is a pharmacy and product that just gives you drug information, not articles, and certainly not peer-reviewed journal articles. So just something to keep in mind. So once you select a subject database that is relevant to your research question, you will search it using the strategies we've practiced so far. And then once you locate an article that you think is good for your topic, you will then need to evaluate it, just as you have with the news article and magazine article for the previous two assignments. So if something is published as a peer-reviewed journal article, implying that it has already been evaluated by researchers in the field relevant to the article, why do you have to evaluate it? Well, one, you want to do the due diligence of making sure that the info is indeed reliable. But really, since scholarly work tends to be very narrow in scope, you want to make sure that the articles you choose really are relevant to your research. You will use similar evaluation criteria that you have been applying throughout the course thus far. But due to the nature of scholarly publishing, you'll want to look for slightly different elements within this set of criteria. For scholarly work, you really want to focus on the pedigree and experience of the authors responsible for the work. You'll want to focus on degrees held, positions currently held, and any experience that you deem relevant. This can include past articles or books written on the topic as well. The more an author has written and researched on a particular topic, the more seasoned of an expert that author is on the topic. The publisher of the article can be significant to its evaluation. You'll want to be sure that the journals that your chosen articles are published in have missions that are consistent with the disciplines and subject areas that are relevant to your topic. Finding an article on marijuana laws in a horticulture journal, for example, might not be as relevant or impactful as one from a legal or political science-centered journal, unless you are talking about marijuana laws in relation to horticulture. There are many different types of publishers of scholarly information. There are academic publishers, usually in the form of university or college presses, or university or college departments that publish academic work in the form of journals. This is typically done in a nonprofit way. There are commercial publishers of scholarly material as well, though. Elsevier is an example of this, as is Taylor and Francis, and textbook entities like McGraw-Hill. These companies are in the for-profit publishing business, as you may know from buying the newest edition of a certain textbook. And then there are government agencies that publish scholarly material. This can be seen in the form of ERIC documents and also as well as articles available through PubMed. When research that is funded by government grants becomes published, it has to be made available to the public for free. So government publications do just that and use interfaces like PubMed to make those items discoverable and accessible. Though not as prominent as when evaluating news or feature articles, you do want to think about the purpose of a scholarly journal article. And so what is the purpose of a particular work? Is it to inform? Is it to sell? Is it to persuade? It's probably not to sell, but perhaps there could be an article that's persuading you to believe a certain vein of research. Is the article objective? Usually you'll be able to tell pretty quickly. There are review articles in scholarly peer-reviewed journals that would not necessarily be objective, but for the most part, the research process and the scientific method ensures that work in scholarly journals is objective. But you do want to be sure if you can identify any potential bias, and I'll talk about that more in a second. You do also want to think about who the intended audience is. Most of the time for scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles, it's going to be advanced researchers in the field or peers of the person that is authoring the paper. But you could have things like members of a particular organization be the audience potentially, but like I said, most of it will be peers of the author themselves. Bias is something to consider when evaluating scholarly work, and usually this refers to funding or conflicts of interest and sometimes the sponsoring of the research that is then published. So bias can refer to the publisher of the information directly. So for example, the Cato Journal, which is published by the Cato Institute, is going to publish mostly things that are leaning toward kind of libertarian ideals, and that's because the Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank. And so what they try to do is they're trying to promote their ideals, so everything is in the lens or the scope of libertarianism. Not to say that the research is necessarily bad, but the things that they're going to choose to research are going to support what the ideals and mission of the Cato Institute are. So there's going to be a certain level of inherent bias in anything that is published in that journal. Again, the research can be sound. It's just, would that research have existed in a certain way had it not been sponsored by the Cato Institute? Those are some just things to consider. So that's where it comes in handy to evaluate the actual publisher in general. So research can also be influenced by sources of funding. So for example, there was a research paper that came out many years ago about the benefits of pomegranate juice to heart health. And you can read the article and you can see that there are lots of benefits to the heart from consuming pomegranate juice. But then when you go to the funding acknowledgments at the end of that article, you find out that the research was actually funded by Pom Wonderful, the company that makes and sells pomegranate juice. So obviously they had a stake in an article that says positive things about the correlation between pomegranate juice and heart health. So not to say that that wouldn't be a good thing to have that research presented. However, if, say, those researchers came up with things that negated the positive correlation between pomegranate juice and heart health, would they simply not have published that? I don't know. It's hard to tell since it did have a positive correlation. So you can see how there can be conflicts of interest even within the funding. And so looking at acknowledgement sections, which I'll mention in a second, is going to be important when evaluating these sources. And then looking at potential conflicts of interest is also going to be important. So the Association of American Medical Colleges defines a potential conflict of interest as any situation in which financial or other personal considerations may compromise or have the appearance of compromising an investigator's judgment in conducting or reporting research. Finding any funding or conflict of interest notes in a scholarly work shouldn't be an issue as long as it's published ethically, and most of the time they are. I don't know too many examples of it not being the case. So anything like this should be added at the end of the published work, and it's often in the acknowledgement section, or sometimes there are sections that will just say fundings or funding sources, or even sometimes conflicts of interest. They'll just go straight out there. And these will be prevalent in scientific, health, environmental, and political research. It's not quite as prevalent in humanities research, mostly because that's just built into those faculty members at a university's job, and it's fairly seldom in social sciences as well. However, sponsors and certainly grant money do help pay for research in many cases. So you do want to keep an eye out and just keep thinking, hey, who might have helped pay for these researchers to actually do the work involved in the research for this article. There are common sources of research funding. Academic institutions are one of the main sources. There are also grants, both government and private. So things like National Institute of Health providing grants for lots and lots of health research. There's also the National Endowment for the Arts, which helps to provide money for research within the humanities. There's also industry sponsorships, which can honestly be potentially problematic, especially with research related to food or health. So companies like Syngenta have in the past been known to pay people to do research on their insecticides and then decide to withhold any research that is found to be negative toward their products. So keeping stuff like that in mind can be important. There are professional societies such as the American Medical Association that can provide research funding. And in situations like this, they don't always disclose conflicts of interest and oftentimes can foster and support media presentations, which is actually a good thing, but can also be like, hey, look at this study on, well, for example, the pomegranate juice. It can, basically what I'm trying to say is these sponsorships can wind up leading to media blasts of scholarship that doesn't necessarily need to become a commercial, if that makes sense. And finally, just like everything else, you do want to evaluate your articles for usefulness. So consider whether the information is what you need for your research question. So questions that you might want to consider here are, is the coverage of the information sufficient? Is it too superficial or lacking in detail? Is it too detailed for your purposes? And this will wrap up the lecture for this unit. It really just deals with thinking about scholarly work in a very concrete way, in that you're going to evaluate it for these certain things that we've talked about here. And again, though, letting it boil down to the overall usefulness to your research need.